Well, I'm Dr. Geraldine Brosfield, and today our topic is good fats and bad fats, and how can we tell the difference and make good choices that promote health in our bodies. So we're going to go through details about fat and some practical application that we can use in how to use fat in our diet for specific purposes to help us be well. So we live in a world of confusion, I guess I would say, where there's all kinds of messaging about what to eat. And for many, many years, fat has been something that we all thought we should avoid. And even my youngest patients, even my teenagers and my young patients will tell me that they think they're not supposed to eat fat when we're trying to decipher how to make good food choices. So it's been a pervasive message, really, for more than really the last 40 years. It's been a message that fat was not good for you and we ought to remove it from our diet. And then recently, research has really taken another look at fat, and there seems to now be a whole other perspective that maybe eating fat is a good thing and that we should eat it. And there's become a lot more confusion because instead of it being a clear message of avoid fat, it's now become a message of maybe fat's okay. And people are confused as to when they should eat fat or what kind of fats are okay. And some of that, I think in an effort towards clarity, some of the physicians that are leaders within the dietary and functional medicine and brain movement have put out books, and now there's a lot of information about fat that we can eat and what it might do for us. And it just, in some ways, feels like we get bombarded with information that's hard to cut through or hard to sort of sift through to find what's applicable to us as an individual. And I kind of think, these different philosophies and different approaches, we could group them into some groups that might be helpful. I'll just mention this because I do think this is where some of the differentiation comes from, in that different voices and different leaders tell us to do different things. And so there are really three main dietary approaches or dietary philosophies that are promoted in our society at this point. And there's lots of variations, but they can kind of be grouped into these three types that are about content. And so on the one side, there's a ketogenic diet or a high-fat, low-carb diet where you could group things like the Atkins diet, the ketogenic diet, a paleo diet into this category. And these all say eating lots of fat is good for you and eating low carbohydrates would be good for you, low starch. Then there's sort of a middle of the road approach where you think of a low glycemic diet or a Mediterranean style diet, where the carbohydrates and proteins tend to be more balanced in a dietary approach. This would encompass diets like the South Beach diet or Body for Life or the Zone diet, or a low glycemic diet or the Mediterranean diet. Those are all sort of in the middle. They're not super low carb, they're low starch, but not particularly high fat. And then a low-fat diet might be the third option to think about, and that's endorsed by people like Dean Ornish and Pritikin and T. Colin Campbell and movies like Forks Over Knives and What the Health sort of go with this zone where it would be really minimal animal products and very low-fat diets. And often these were called plant-based, but there's a little misnomer about that because any of these could have a lot of plants in them. And really the biggest difference in these approaches tends to be around fat. And so I think this is where some of the confusion has come in these different approaches about fat. And now there's a whole other layer about the intervals with which we eat. So whether we eat small frequent meals or whether we fast for parts of our days or week are other changes and philosophies that you could overlay on top of having chosen a specific dietary content. So these feeding intervals can go along with specific choices about what food you eat. So where did some of the myths come from? And I think the biggest myth, honestly, that is sort of behind part of the story about fat was the myth that calories in equals calories out. And for a long time, in fact, this is called the law of thermodynamics. And it's that energy is conserved. And so if you eat 100 calories and you only burn 50, that means there's an extra 50 calories in your body that you're going to store, and that's how we get fat. And so this has been propagated really for at least 50 years, in that the approach around saying we needed to even count calories really grew out of this law of thermodynamics. And even the approach that really fed into the myth around fat being bad for us came from the concept of, if we eat too many calories, we're going to get fat. And fat as a food has many more calories in it. It has a little bit more than twice the number of calories as do protein or carbohydrates. So there sort of became a group of thoughts that worked together to propagate each other, and none of them were exactly accurate. So the concept of calories in, calories out is not accurate. In fact, we now know that hormones like insulin have a huge impact on whether or not we burn those calories or store calories. And so you could eat fat. You're going to find out here as we talk today. We could eat fat, which would be high calories. So I could eat 100 grams of fat, so to speak, and not move my blood sugar up, which would mean I would not store that fat. So that fat would get burned and used in my body for the energy I need, but it would not get stored as fat or stored as cholesterol. And so this really needs a great big X through this picture, because calories in do not equal calories out. Calories in equal, they get worked on by our system and our metabolism and our levels of insulin and our levels of hormone or our microbiome. And then the calories out and the way we use those calories are not equivalent necessarily. They're so dependent on each individual system. So this thought did not end up propagating accuracy in our perspectives about fat. In fact, it fed the myth that fat was bad for us. And if you look at how we eat in America and where we get our calories from, you can notice that, we have pretty similar intake of grain versus fats versus meats, eggs, and nuts. And the thing about this slide that just is the most profound to me is how small our fruit and vegetable intake is. Like, this is very minimal calories that we take in a day on average in America from fruit and vegetables, but a lot from grains, fats, and proteins. So an interesting point when we just look at things and say, well, what do we need to shift for health? Is it really that we need to decrease fats per se, or is it that we need to increase our fruits and vegetables? A little bit of a chicken or the egg kind of question. In about 1977, there was an incredible product brought to the market, and I think of it as the start of the low-fat movement. And that was those amazing little fat-free cookies. And you know what's funny is right now I can't remember the name of them. They're like mints. And so those little chocolate mint cookies that were so yummy that we wanted to eat them, but they had no fat in them. And I really think of those as the beginning of the low-fat movement in about 1977, where society and maybe our manufacturers really realized that there was an incredible marketing opportunity to market around low fat. And so fat was removed from so much of our food. It's where we began having non-fat yogurts and non-fat cookies and non-fat everything. And to the degree that I even laughed because I had a non-fat sticker on my bananas recently that I just thought was ridiculous. But this low-fat movement began in the late 1970s. And one of the crazy things is that at that point in time, because of fat being removed, what do you do if you remove the main flavor source of food? You've got to put something in there that will make people want to eat it, either to make it taste good or to have repeat buyers. And so sugar content and starch content began to rise in our food as we went to a low-fat diet in about 1977. And if you look at this slide, this is the obesity rates in different age groups of people starting from about 1970 until 2006. And you can see that there's a definite change in the slope of this line. In other words, when we look at about 1976 and 1977, when the guidelines came out advocating that we eat a low-fat diet, we started to see a spike in our obesity rates, and those rates have continued to spike as our starch and sugar content went up and our fat content went down. If we look at added fats in our diet, even going back through the whole last century, you can see that the oils in our diet, which are this more bright blue line, have really spiked since about 1995 or so. We, in the past, used more hard fats like butter and lard, and those have stayed fairly steady and, in fact, declined during the mid-century as we started to increase our use of oils and extracted fats. This lavender color is shortening and could include things even certainly like Crisco, but could also include things like margarine, which has fallen off here. So I guess that's not included in this, but would be harder shortening type fats that you can buy like palm oil or Crisco. And that certainly has taken a dive, even though it started to rise through the years of women baking at home after World War II. So the biggest take home from this slide to me is that our oil consumption has drastically increased, particularly in the last 10 years and now 20 years. We've seen an increase in extracted oil use in our country. But if we plug in 1977 about here, you can see, yes, we've had an increase of oil use that concurred with low fat in everything else in our diet. So some notable facts about fat. Fat has almost no effect on our blood sugar or insulin. So I mentioned that the way we process foods and the way we process calories is really dependent on our own metabolism and our own hormones. And I was indicating insulin when I mentioned those hormones more than anything. Insulin decides whether or not we store our food or whether we burn our food for fuel. And if our insulin levels are high, we actually store our food. If our insulin levels are steady or lower, then we can burn the food. And so fat actually doesn't raise insulin, and so we do not store it because the insulin levels stay low when we're eating fat. Fat also provides about twice the energy or calories per gram as carbs or protein. From our labels, you may know this, that fat equals 9 grams per calorie, whereas protein and carbohydrates equal 4. And so it is definitely a higher energy source than would be the other food groups. And fat is really necessary. I often, when I'm working with patients, will look at what's going on with them and say, you know what, we need to increase fat in your diet. Your skin dryness or your hair breakage is very likely due to low fat in your diet, and we may need to actually add fat into a diet. Our brain is actually also made up of about 75% fat. Every nerve in our body, and particularly in our brain, is covered with a coating that's made of fat. And that is extremely important. It's one of the reasons that children under the age of 5 need a high-fat diet in particular in order for that brain nerve formation to occur. But I would almost posit it to say that we all need some fat much higher than what we have thought, even after the age of 5. This is a demonstration of what I was mentioning with the impact of insulin. If we eat foods that raise blood sugar and insulin is high and spikes after each meal, that promotes a situation where we would actually store the food that we're eating, and we would store it as body fat. But if in fact we ate a diet where there was some fat, like if we imagine fat itself would make this blue line virtually flat to baseline. So fat helps tone down the blood sugar rises that we have when we eat food. And so, for instance, as strange as this sounds, someone eating a chicken taquito that has been fried in fat will have less of a blood sugar spike than they would if they just ate the tortilla and chicken by itself. And so, not that I'm promoting deep frying, but fat in our diet does lower the spike of our insulin and our cortisol, as well as our blood sugar. And that helps that insulin stay steady, which helps it burn the food as fuel instead of storing it. So this low constant level of insulin is a real key to the fact that we don't store fat as body fat. This is a different slide of how our diet in America is, and there's a different notice here that I want to mention. If you look as percent of calories, and remember we just said that fat is higher calorically than would be plants or proteins, but as calories, in the United States, we take in about 63% of our diet as fat in a typical standard American diet. We're going to dig into why that's a problem, because if in fact we were doing, excuse me, I should have read that as processed food, because that 63% includes refined grains in this slide, and I just misread that. So if you look at our processed food coming in as 63%, if in fact 63% was truly healthy fat and not processed foods, this diagram might not be as far off as we would think. In other words, we could make plants a little bit bigger in this diagram, but in the ketogenic diets or the paleo diets, they are pushing towards 65% fat in the diet of healthy fats, but without any processed foods or refined grains. And so this just is a good reminder of how far off our typical diet is, as far as how accustomed and conditioned we've become to having refined grains, fats, and sugars in our diet. In fact, our manufacturers of food have a term called the bliss point that they drive towards, and that is if they can have a food that makes us absolutely love it and crave eating more of it, then they've got a winner on a product that they'll put on the market, because it keeps their sales high of that product. And so it's really this processed food that includes fats and oils and sugars and refined grains that is one of the major problems with what's wrong with our diet today. So how do we make healthy fat choices, and what are fats that we should eat? Well, nuts, olives, fish, flax seeds, coconut oils, all are fairly calorie dense, but those are clean fats. And those fats also contain what are called essential fatty acids, which are the fats that we need for our body to be able to make the linings that line each nerve and help our hair and our skin and cellular function. I mentioned that fats help keep insulin low. They also actually help us remove the sugar from our fat cells. And so having healthy fats helps us clean up some of the stored sugars in our cells. And typically, they also protect our brain against memory loss and preserve our nerve function. Many of us have heard of omega-3s. Those are predominantly in fish. They also exist in flax and krill and some nuts. So there's a little bit of omega-3 even in walnuts, for instance. And one of the beautiful reasons that we have heard that we should promote and take in omega-3 is that they are anti-inflammatory. I think of omega-3 fats almost like a mini Advil in a way. It's not that they're synthetic or work in the same way, but they do have an anti-inflammatory effect. And for many people, even with really severe joint pain, for instance, high doses of omega-3 make a difference in reducing their pain. One thing to note, if you're eating flax as your source of omega-3, we are able to process about 10% of the plant versions of omega-3 versus a much higher percentage of the fish or krill. The animal sources of omega-3 are much more bioavailable, and you can count on really close between 90 and 95% of that fish oil, for instance, being available for your body, whereas flax has to get converted in the body with different enzymes, and so only about 10% of it has an impact on your omega-3 levels. Omega-6 causes inflammation. It's the it's an anti-inflammatory. It does the opposite. In other words, it causes inflammation. And in particular, if it's not in balance with omega-3 and omega-9, it causes inflammation. So one of the, I guess I would say one of the biggest marketing ridiculous ventures that I see out there is when we see these bottles of omega-3, 6 plus 9 on the shelf to take. And I'll tell you why. Omega-6 is everywhere around us. If you have eaten a cracker that had fat in it that wasn't specifically, maybe coconut oil would be one, coconut and palm oil might be the only exceptions to what I'm going to say. So if there's fat in the cracker that you're eating, it is very likely an omega-6 type of fat. So every baked good that has fat in it, unless the company has specifically tried to put butter, coconut oil, or palm oil in that product, will have high omega-6. And the reason is that omega-6 fats are extremely shelf stable. These are things like your corn oil or sunflower oil or grapeseed oil. And so all the oils that certainly the ones I grew up with thinking were oil, vegetable oil, for instance, are high in omega-6. And I'll show you some examples of that. And that causes inflammation. So we do not need to take omega-6 as a supplement. It is so pervasive that even if you try to avoid omega-6, you'll likely get some of it if you ever eat out or eat a salad dressing. And so I just choose not to try to take in extra omega-6. And then I actually try to avoid omega-6 in my diet because I know that some is going to creep in there from any time I eat out at a restaurant that may have fried my food in, say, a corn oil, or if I have a commercially prepared salad dressing. Omega-9 is a healthy type of fat, and it really is a fat that's better to be taken in food rather than a supplement because it's not very stable. It's called monounsaturated, which means it has lots of spots on the molecule where changes can occur. And so because it's not really stable, it's better to get it in a food source. And they're good foods. Nuts, avocados, and olives are some of my favorite foods. So it's very easy to get plenty of omega-9 in your diet. It can be something you strive to get into your diet for healthy fats. You can choose not to add omega-6 in any way that you're aware of, and you'll still probably get plenty of it. And then you can work to add omega-3 either by eating salmon or getting flax meal or taking a fish oil supplement. The optimal ratio of these three types of fat is 1 to 1 to 1. So in America, typically our ratio between omega-3 and omega-6 ranges from 1 part omega-3 to 20 to 40 parts omega-6 because it's so pervasive in the dietary products we purchase now. So in essence, what we always would want to be doing is decreasing our omega-6, getting our omega-9 from foods, and to get our omega-3 from foods or supplements. This is a slide showing how cardiac death you can see in several different countries is elevated with, or how it's associated with omega-6 intake. So if you notice that the higher the percentage of arachidonic acid, which is what's in omega-6, so the higher the percentage of that in the cells, the higher the mortality from coronary heart disease. So the lower rates over here, where in Greenland and Japan, they have lower rates of heart disease, also correlate with less omega-6 in the diet. And I would hazard a guess that this is very likely due to the amount of prepared baked goods. Baked goods tend to be one of the main sources of omega-6 because we put these shelf-stable oils in the baked goods and we know they won't go rancid if they sit on the shelf. But this risk of death is definitely associated with omega-6 intake. Common types of fats in oils, you can see on the left column are the names of common oils, in the middle is omega-6 content, and then on the right is omega-3 content. You can see that fish oil is all good, it's all omega-3. Flaxseed is about 57% omega-3 and a little bit of omega-6. Walnut oil has very little omega-3, but a little bit is there, but more omega-6. And canola oil, of all of the vegetable oils, canola oil is the lowest in its omega-6 content and doesn't have a lot of omega-3, but a little bit. So if you were going to pick a oil off of this list, picking down near the bottom of the list is going to be better. And really, of those oils, walnut and flaxseed oil would be fairly unstable oils you wouldn't want to cook with. Canola oil would be okay to cook with, but you can see from there it really rises quickly as to how much omega-6 is present in a tablespoon of any one of those oils. Another way to look at that same information is on this slide, and this may seem a little bit like sometimes I look at the slide and I have to stop and reorient myself. But what you want from this slide would be the least amount of blue. So blue is the fats that are in the omega-6 family, the arachidonic acid and the linoleic acid. And so if you look at saying, okay, at the very bottom, for instance, coconut oil has a lot of saturated fat in it, but it has very, very little omega-6 in it. Whereas look further up, olive oil, which is about the fifth one down, olive oil has very little of the omega-6 and quite a bit of the monounsaturated, which is quite healthy for us. And so when I look at this list and say, okay, whichever types of fat have the least blue would be the ones I want to use the most, you can see canola oil again comes out the best of some of the vegetable oils, but olive oil really shines here from the standpoint of not having much omega-6 in it. And the only drawback with olive oil is that it doesn't do well at high heat. So in our household, and what I advocate to patients is that they choose to use butter and coconut oil, which are down at the very bottom of this list, to use butter, fat, and coconut oil for their higher heat cooking, and to use olive oil for either very low heat cooking or for flavoring, like a salad dressing or like putting on your vegetables after you cook them or in beans or that kind of thing. So using it in times where you wouldn't be increasing the heat drastically would be appropriate. Just again to drive home the point, because saturated fat has become quite a topic of conversation. And what we're learning is that saturated fat really has another couple questions we need to ask about it, and that is the source of saturated fat. I don't advocate eating lots and lots of animal fat, but I will say that if you're having a clean saturated fat that's coming from a grass-fed animal or from coconut and palm oil, that is not harmful to the body. And in fact, in this slide, at the top half of the slide are countries that have low levels of saturated fat in their diet. And the other side of the bar shows that there's a lot more death of heart disease in the countries that have low saturated fat. Whereas at the bottom of the slide are countries that have lower rates of heart disease, but higher levels of saturated fat in their diet. It's interesting, those countries, Austria, Finland, Belgium, Iceland, Netherlands, and Switzerland, and France, we think of those diets as maybe having a lot of butter or a lot of fish in those diets. And those types of intakes are lower or are correlated with lower incidence of heart disease. What is correlated with heart disease in particular, other than saturated fat, other than low intake of saturated fat, what is correlated with heart disease is high intake of trans fats or hydrogenated fats. So in our country, really when the low-fat diet revolution sort of hit and those recommendations were provided by our government to say this is how America ought to eat, there was also another force occurring at a similar time, and that was that our farmers were wanting to be able to utilize homegrown American fat. And so things like our vegetable oils that had been grown by our farmers in our country were really processed and studied in order to be used in our society for food. And hydrogenated fats were born. So it was found that you could change the structure of the fat molecule and make it be partially solid. And so then we got to things like margarines or some of the solid fats that are from plant sources. And then the other thing that happened was that it was found that by whipping these vegetable oils, you could make them into a creamy type substance. And so then we got to my very favorite coffee creamer for many years, but hydrogenated vegetable oils in things like coffee creamers or non-dairy creamers. And the problem is that those hydrogenated fats and trans fats are a fat where the molecular structure has been changed. And we know that these are extremely toxic. These types of fats have been linked to causing heart attacks and stroke and memory loss. And they're often used in many foods that for years we thought were sort of quote unquote healthy because they were non-dairy or they were, not animal fat or not saturated fat. But it turns out that they are really awful. And in fact, thankfully, I think in a move that is an accurate move, we're going to be starting to see labels demonstrate and tell us how much trans fat is in a product as well. The other thing here at the bottom is that if you're eating meat from a grain-fed animal, you're going to be getting food that is higher in omega-6. So if you imagine going back to the omega-6 versus omega-3 balance, if you're eating a food that has a lot of grain in it, that'll have a lot of omega-6 in it and that fat, and you'll end up being inflammatory to your body because you've been eating a grain-fed animal. So we are what the cows eat is kind of how I would say. If you're someone who eats beef, whatever the source of your meat product, you are going to be getting the same qualities as the quality of their food when you eat that meat. Some of the examples as this information has become more widespread, one of the examples is the bulletproof diet. And bulletproof coffee is a version of coffee that includes putting MCT or a version of coconut oil along with butter, grass-fed butter, in your coffee and then frothing that, and it'll actually make it like a latte and make it creamy, because as that fat disperses, it foams up and creams up. So on this page, you'll see the variation of good to bad on fats and sort of looking at some of the relative value between these different types of fats. So you can see on the left-hand side are things that we've often thought of as saturated fat when we think of things like butter and coconut oil and palm oil. They are indeed saturated, but they're very stable and very well tolerated by the body. And then also, as we start to see fats that we would want to avoid on the right, you can see those are fats that have more of a grain impact or have been hydrogenated or made from trans fats. Again, this infographic I think you may be able to even find just by searching fats and oils and clicking on images on your computer. But one of the nice things about this page is it does describe which saturated fats are stable for hot uses and which other fats are good for cold uses. So you can see that coconut and palm oil have a really high smoke point, and they're stable in a hot format. And the same thing with butter and some of the other animal fats, that they're stable at high heat. Whereas the unsaturated fats can change with high heat. And so things like olive oil, nut oils, and sesame oils, you would want to use only when cold. And then this has a nice list of the things to avoid down at the bottom. Why do we need fat? I want to come back to this for just a minute. Brain function is one of the main reasons. If we look at what allows the brain to function the best, there are now known to be a number of foods that we almost would think of as superfoods. All of us would maybe say blueberries in the first list on this. But notice of these brain superfoods, how many of them highlighted here in yellow are fats. And you could even say grass-fed beef would be a source of fat that was more omega-3 if it was grass-fed. But coconut, wild salmon, avocado, almonds, and olive oil are all good sources of healthy fats that help the mitochondria and help promote good brain function. Looking at some of the other benefits to these foods that we tend to think of as fats, if you look at nuts, there are many, many other minerals and vitamins in nuts, for instance, that are important that we would really enjoy in our diet and benefit from, that would help us make the other enzymes in our body that are needed. In addition, seeds like pumpkin seeds and sesame seeds, chia seeds, have omega-3 from plant bases and also have a lot of antioxidants and minerals in them that are beneficial to our body as well, but are another healthy fat source. And also coconut is another healthy fat source that we're realizing provides medium chain triglyceride, which is a really specific type of fat that the brain can use without having to do a lot of processing in the liver. So sort of the key behind that bulletproof coffee recipe is that it uses two foods, the coconut and butter, that are rich in medium chain triglycerides and allow the body to get that specific kind of fat as fuel directly to the brain, which promotes good thinking and clarity of the mind. Again, avocado, can't almost stress this one enough. We almost all could eat an avocado a day and do well. There are a few people, and some of you that have done genetic testing with me know that there are some of us that don't manage fat as well as others, and so maybe not a whole avocado for those of us with those genetic changes. But if you look at the sources of omega-3 and other vitamins that avocado performs or provides, it's an excellent source of fat in our diet. So when we look at the reasons for choosing to have higher fat in our diet, I really would say brain is number one and heart might be number two, because healthy fats are beneficial in that they don't store as cholesterol in the body and help the body and help the muscle of the body work well as the brain work well. And so in summary, I just want to say this is sort of a list of what I would say would be incorporated into a diet that was specifically beneficial for the brain and really all systems of the body as well, but particularly for brain and heart health. So if we follow a diet that's rich in plant sources of food, so nuts, olive oil, abundant fresh produce, as well as fish, would be a really good basis for a dietary content. Getting plenty of omega-3 fats, in particular in fish, our fish oil, and then in some of our seeds. It's absolutely okay to include coconut oil, even though it's a saturated fat that has made people worry in the past. We've now learned that that does not contribute to heart disease, and in fact may help prevent it. And then you can pick an eating pattern of either eating 4 to 6 small meals throughout your day, or limiting your eating window to 6 to 8 hours of your day. Or within that 6 to 8 hours, you can also still eat small meals during that time frame. Eating across the rainbow comes back to the whole plant-based approach with many phytonutrients because of the different colors of food that you would eat. And then we've learned that tea and coffee are really good antioxidants also. And so having some tea or coffee in our day is also beneficial for brain and heart health. So whatever steps you can do on this list are beneficial. One of the things we've learned is that it's not an all or none approach. In other words, if you were even able to do one thing off of that list, you're going to benefit from it. And certainly the more that we do, the better. But even a small effort in this day would make a difference. So if nothing else on this list, go eat some colorful fruits and vegetables or get your tea or coffee in your day, and that's a good start. And then you can move towards these kinds of actions as you go. Please know that at Exo Health, we're very happy to partner with you to do testing and individualize your diet. And we work with patients to be sure that they are metabolizing fat and that in fact their body is doing well with that. We look at their cholesterol particles and brain health through all the testing that we do. And if you would like us to work with you, we'd be happy to set up a consult virtually or in person. So I appreciate you being with us. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask them or send them to us. Thank you.